Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is the Executive Director of the Native Addictions Council of Manitoba. Theresa Crow Spreading His Wings is a Blackfoot First Nation woman from the Blood Tribe in Treaty 7 territory. Theresa grew up in the child welfare system as part of the 60s Scoop. She moved to Winnipeg in 2004, where she's been serving the inner city community and an advocate for adults, youth, and families that are struggling with addictions, poverty, and mental well-being. Theresa, thanks so much for being with us this week.
Thanks for having me here.
Addictions is a huge issue, not just here in Winnipeg either, right across Turtle Island. You've been with the Native Addictions Council for a few years now. Are things getting worse?
Things are getting worse. You can see that especially in communities and in Winnipeg. And the opioid and fentanyl crisis is rampant. When I started in this field like almost 20 years ago, there was lots of alcohol and solvents, but you can see that increase over the years, and it's at an alarming rate.
We hear that there is an opioid crisis, an overdose crisis. Is that your take, that we're experiencing both of those right now? For sure there is. It's a lot of people that are coming through NACM. When NACM started, it was rooted in a problem with alcohol. But with the drugs and the increase of drugs, we see a lot more people using opioids and crack and meth and really hardcore drugs. And so to me, that's an indicator of people's pain and an indicator of a loss of people's way in life, that they're using stronger things and whatever they can get their hands on. So part of that is that opioid crisis. It's just you can find it anywhere and everywhere. Right. We seem to be thankfully coming out of this pandemic, but what role do you think the pandemic had to play in people's addictions?
Oh man, that's a good question. With the pandemic, I mean, for everybody, it was a worldwide traumatic experience. And so it isolated people. It was, no one actually knew what to do or where to go. So part of that, for people that were rooted in their addictions, again, it's an isolation of that sense of belonging, that sense of hope. So part of that result from the pandemic was you're alone and you're home, and so no matter whether you're isolated or with a large group of people, when you're addiction, you will find that. And so I think part of that residue from that global pandemic is that people started to increase their use. And there was a lot more deaths because people were alone and there wasn't the resources or access to resources, which are already limited. And so that increase just really isolated people and the crisis that we see that we're in now from that pandemic.
So it is fair to say that the pandemic has had a huge impact, obviously on mental health, but on addictions as well.
Yeah, I would say that's fair to say. And we can see it in the lack of services. We can see it everywhere. And before I came here, just walking around the block, you can see so many people that are Indigenous on the streets with nowhere to go. And so again, it's just a disconnect from their communities, a disconnect from their families, their friends, and that's all part of that residue from the pandemic as well, right? It isolated us all. It even isolated us from our own families that lived a couple blocks away. So when those needs increase that sense of disengagement, we want to fill that, and especially if we struggle with addictions.
What role does housing play in all this from the relatives that you work with? Is housing something that has an impact on all of this as well?
Housing has been an impact for years, not just since I've been with Native Addiction. And when I started here in
Winnipeg in 2004 and moved here from Alberta, I work with people without homes. And of course, that was everyone was struggling with addictions, without homes. And when they are in our treatment center, housing is a huge thing. We just actually had a graduation, and someone thought that they had somewhere to go after their program, and we called 6 different resources and trying to find somewhere for her to be able to stay. And so housing is a huge deficit for people that are living on the streets, and especially people that are struggling with addiction. There's a lot of couch surfing that happens. Even when they're trying to get into a center or get into detox, there's a lot of couch surfing. So housing is a huge crisis as well.
How concerning is that for you? You know, somebody takes the initiative to go and seek out help and graduate from one of these programs and then has nowhere to go.
Yeah, it's really concerning. More disheartening. I feel disheartened sometimes for the people that have committed their lives to help others. The people that work at NACM have all gone through their own addiction stories or their own trauma to be able to help. I mean, that's normal in that service field. But when we don't have anywhere to send people and they're coming from places that there's not secure housing, it doesn't help the situation. And we have people coming from northern communities that may have homes or may not have homes. In northern communities, there's multiple people living in one home. And so that housing crisis, we send people back to something that's not healthy that they're trying to recover from. And so that cycle just continues and continues and continues. And housing is one piece of that huge puzzle of a journey to healing and recovery.
Yeah. A few years back, the Canadian Medical Association Journal published a report called Reconciliation and Canada's Overdose Crisis, and it found that the drug overdose crisis disproportionately affected Indigenous peoples owing to a legacy of colonization, racism, intergenerational trauma. That was about 6 years ago that report came out. Is that still, valid and accurate today?
Is it valid and accurate that the housing crisis or the history of Indigenous?
The overdose crisis is disproportionately affecting.
Yeah, absolutely. You can see that over and over again. When we talk about truth and reconciliation, one of the things that is the buzzword is reconciliation. The unfortunate part is that we're not speaking enough about the truth and having a real understanding the truth and the impacts of colonization. And from residential school, I was part of the 60s scoop. And those things continue today because we have colonial systems that we live in. And so it's very hard for us to move forward as Indigenous people when our systems continue to hold us back with the lack of housing, or we have lots of people that come, probably 70% to 80% that are being told by CFS to come and do an addiction treatment center, but they're not given anything else to help them and jump through these hoops. And so that crisis to go back to their drug use is just perpetuated, and so that increased for sure.
Theresa, I want to definitely get into those colonial systems, the child welfare system, and the impact on all this, but I think we better step aside for a break first, because that'll be quite a conversation. So we'll step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with Theresa Crow, Spreading His Wings, the Executive Director of the Native Addictions Council of Manitoba. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Theresa Crow, Spreading His Wings, the Executive Director of Native Addictions Council of Manitoba. And before we went to the break, we were kind of touching on the colonial systems that have a big role, I think, to play in all this. How many of the people involved with the services you provide are people who have been in the child welfare system or still have, some connection to the child welfare system?
A connection to the child welfare system, probably 100% at some point or another. I think one of the things that I was saying before our little break there was that CFS is a very colonial system, and so probably 70 to 80%, if not more, have either gone through the system or connected or mandated to come to NACM for programming. And but when we look at the colonial system of residential schools, 60 scoop, child welfare is just another one of those colonial systems. And so when I say 100% have somewhere been rooted, when I think of the residue from all those generational traumas that have happened, it continues to affect us moving forward. And so we have to find a new way to do those things and start to cultivate safe spaces for our people and give them a sense of belonging and a sense of hope, which means intentionally figuring out how do we decolonize in a colonial system. And that's something that's been really important to me in how we offer our services at NACM.
Going to talk about that in a second as well too, but in the intro we mentioned that you grew up in the child welfare system, a survivor of the 60 scoop as well. How has that impacted the work that you do?
It's had a large impact, not that it's on a scale, but being part of the 60 scoop, I was taken when I was 4 and I was living on the Kanea Reserve, which is also known as the Blood Reserve in southern Alberta. And I was living with my aunt. I was being raised by my mom and dad until I was 4. And so when I was taken from my home, I lost all connection with my family, and that continues with all people that have been part of the CFS that are Indigenous. So I lost my family, my language, my understanding of who I am as an Indigenous woman. And so part of that journey, I was raised in a white home, and so there was lots of stereotypes and biases that I had to overcome of who I am. And because residential school and the history of Indigenous people has been not always talked about, it wasn't until my 40s that I really realized the impacts of those. So now I'm moving into my 50s. I had to do a lot of hard work, not hard work, but heart work, and sit and work on my own trauma before I could help others. But that also gave me a lot of compassion, care, and love and understanding, because I was raised with people that were not healthy, but also I had connection to my mom who struggled with addictions, and not knowing her history, and my sister, and I have brothers and sisters I've never met that were part of the 60 Scoop. So when I work with people that struggle with addictions, everybody has a story. And that's where we have to come from, is everyone has a story. It's easy to just look at people and just say, well, they did that to themselves. It's a deep, deep conversation, and it's a long, long healing journey for a lot of people, and the recovery of the addiction crisis that we find ourselves in today.
You talked about decolonizing the systems and supports, and one of those things that you do is around language itself too. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that and why you feel that's important?
I'm learning my language, a few words here and there, but as Indigenous people, our language connects us back to land, and part of our healing is going to be connecting us back to land. I always say that as Indigenous people, we've been gifted with having a spirit that connects us to Creator, that connects us back to the land, that connects us back to our language. And so some of the things that I'm learning is that our language, when we speak English, it's complicated because some words have 5 different meanings. In Indigenous language, there might be one word that means a lot of things that we can't describe, or there's not a word for those things. So one of the words that I've learned is kimopitasin, which means giving kindness to others in Blackfoot. But it also means having empathy. It also means giving back of what you've been given. It also means walking in a kind way. So when we start to reclaim our language, that piece kind of knits our hearts back, that helps us reconnect back to that land. Because when we're not doing that, what happens is we turn to things that are not healthy for us, and we turn to things that perpetuate our trauma. And so for Indigenous people, I'm a strong believer that land heals, and if we aren't doing our heart work, we will never heal in our communities, in our societies. And so it's an important part, that language piece. And knowing where we're from, and knowing what our tribe is. Are we Cree? Are we Ojibwe? All those things connect us back to our language, because that was taken from us, in how we walked and how we lived.
Some of the things that you do there as well around the English language is how you refer to those that utilize the services, not referring to them as clients, but as relatives, because really they are somebody's relatives.
Yeah. When I went to as an executive director at NECM, one of the things that was really important to me was decolonizing. What did that mean to me? Because I realized that I had been given a sacred responsibility. And so there were a few things that I changed in language. I didn't want to lead an organization that was residential anything, because that's a very colonial word. That's not a healing word. Institutionalized, those things. So we did change the language. So one of the things clients, and that for me in my work, is that when you go way back in the root of those words, it means to disempower. And so as Indigenous people, we've been disempowered enough. That's the whole colonial system, right? We know what we need. Like each individual person, you know what you need if you really go into your heart. Communities know what they need if we sit down and take the time to have that conversation. And so we changed our language from clients to relatives, participants, and applicants, because we want to empower people. Part of addiction throughout history is that you don't have power to heal, or you don't have power over your addiction. Again, that's just another disempowering message for Indigenous people, that this is who you are and you have to stay down there, and hopefully you'll find a nice program that will help you. But we want to empower people. We are relatives. We are all related somehow. And again, back to that land, we're always connected. We're related by spirit, by language, by community.
Theresa, much more to talk about here. We just do need to step aside for one more quick commercial break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face.
That's great.
Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Theresa Crow, spreading his wings, the Executive Director of Native Addictions Council of Manitoba. Theresa, what are some of the programs, the services that you offer that you feel really make a difference?
Our in-house healing program is our live-in program, and we offer traditional healing practices, which means we take some Western and we connect it with land. And so part of that is we have knowledge keepers come in, we go back to the land, we do sweats, we do ceremonies, and we learn together. We've become a learning organization, so that's been really important. Supporting people in our recovery care program, which is a day program, and helping them to figure out how to live in community and find the resources that they need. Our program is only 6 weeks, so it's just a tiny drop in the bucket of their healing journey.
we just received some funding that we're going to start doing some healing camps. So again, it's just taking people out to the land. So we do it, our programming a little bit different in regards to not being super clinical, and we really want to connect people back to their identity and who they are, and just help get that substance out of their system so that they can start their journey in a good way.
We hear a lot of how there's not enough beds in this province, enough space for people that want to use these services. You've mentioned that staffing is also an issue. What's something that government of any level could do that could help the work that you do?
Funding is always a big thing. Mm-hmm. And right now we have 10 beds, and it costs us about $1.2 million for 10 beds. And in regards to, say, provincial funding, who is a funder, only gives us about 663, but they demand 100% of these qualifications. So I think for the government, we need to be all at the table and having a conversation of how do we offer services, how do we properly do services so that we're also just not filling beds without proper support, proper staffing altogether. And so that's probably one of the big messages. Money is primary in finding resources, but you have to bring all the right people to the table. I know I've heard lots of conversations about addictions and all that stuff, and now there's new, like an addiction pathway. For Native addictions, we were never invited to that table. Yeah. And so I've written the province, and they've been gracious in meeting with us and coming and touring, but the conversation starts there. It has to continue, as we move forward. So, but there's lots of empty buildings. We kind of put the money, in my opinion, for the wrong things. When we're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars changing signs, which I totally respect in regards to decolonizing some of our city names, that could go to a program. As Indigenous organizations, we get a small pool of money, so we're always competing against one another. In Manitoba, we have the highest population of Indigenous people. So bringing us all to the table and us not having to wrestle or fight for that funding, but finding proper supports and conversations that we can help bring healing and resources and supports and beds and safe places for people to go. Not on the street.
Right. Well, Theresa, unfortunately we're out of time, but appreciate you taking some of your time to be with us and all the work that you do out there as well. So thanks for being with us this week.
Thanks for having me here. It's a real privilege.
And that is all the time for this week's episode of Face to Face. We will see you back here for a new episode next Tuesday.